What's the darkest manipulation tactic you've ever uncovered? My parents smiled at me over breakfast and said, "We've decided we need to be more strict. Starting today, you can't leave your room after 7 p.m. I laughed, because the last time I broke one of their rules and snuck out, they just asked if the party was any good. But that night at 7 p.m. sharp, Dad actually walked me to my room. I was still smiling, waiting for the punchline, when I heard the lock click from the outside. "Dad?" I rattled the handle. Nothing. Through the door, I heard them laugh like it was a parenting win. From there, something shifted. It was 3 a.m. when my parents burst into my room yelling, "Room inspection!" My heart nearly exploded. Mom started counting my shoes while Dad checked under the bed with a flashlight. "What the hell is happening?" I asked, still half asleep. Mom turned to me with this concerned face. "Language. And why are you being so dramatic? This is perfectly normal." She used to stroke my hair when I had nightmares. Now she wouldn't even look me in the eye. Every night after that, 3 a.m. became inspection time. I stopped sleeping, just waited for them to burst in. That's when I noticed they looked happy. The more exhausted I got, the more energy they seemed to have, like vampires or something. After a week of no sleep, they installed cameras in my room. "For your safety," Mom said sweetly. The cameras beeped every 30 seconds, all night long. These were the same parents who gave me bread to sober up when I came home drunk at 16, and waited until the next day to give out to me. By day 10, I was hallucinating from exhaustion. I tried to hug my parents in the kitchen, desperate for any warmth. They stepped back like I was contagious. "Personal space," my dad said flatly. I knew I had to do something. It felt like they were trying to break me. So I tested them. I stayed out 5 minutes past curfew to see what would happen. Mom's reaction was insane, screaming, crying, threatening to send me to military school. But as she grounded me for a month, I saw it, the corner of her mouth twitching up into a smirk, like this was part of her daily entertainment. The next day, I took it further. I failed a chemistry test on purpose, just wrote my name and handed it in blank. Dad's rage shook the house, but walking past their room later, I heard him whisper to Mom, "He's finally doing it." My blood went cold. That night, while they drank wine and laughed about something, I cracked. I just wanted my parents back, the ones who used to tuck me in and call me their miracle. So for the first time in years, I thought about what life would be like if I met my biological mother, if she never put me up for adoption. I just needed to feel wanted by someone, anyone. I snuck into Mom's study and opened her laptop to Facebook to search for my bio mom's name. In the corner of the screen was a notification from Maria Tendalea, my bio mom. I clicked, and my heart dropped. My bio parents had been writing for years, begging my mom to let her into my life. But one message made me freeze. "We know about the insurance. We'll pay you double to give him back." That's when I found the policy documents and everything finally clicked. Why they were punishing me for no reason. Why they wanted me gone. If I left my home voluntarily before turning 18, they would receive $30,000 for disruption of adoption. The whole time, my parents were trying to get me to leave the only home I'd ever known. In Dad's desk, I found a folder labeled with my name. Inside were boarding school applications, already half filled out. At dinner, I spread everything on the table. "Just tell me why," I said. Dad set down his water glass carefully, like he'd been expecting this. Mom's hand moved to her stomach in that protective way. That's when I knew. "You're pregnant. 4 months," she said. "So I'm just the practice kid?" My voice cracked. She didn't deny it. "With our real baby. Do you know what IVF costs? What we sacrificed? We took out loans," Dad said. "Mortgaged the house. And then we found out you were worth $50,000, but only if you leave on your own." "But my bio parents," I whispered. "They've been trying to warn me." Mom's mask finally slipped. "Those criminals? They sold you for $20,000, sweetheart. You think they want you back out of love? They want to sue us for money we don't have anymore." "We did love you," Dad said, "until the pregnancy test. Then you became a problem with a solution. $50,000. That's what 15 years added up to. That's what every bedtime story, every birthday, every I love you was worth." Mom pushed a paper across the table. "Sign this. Say you want to live with Grandma. This way we all get what we need." I picked up the pen. My hand was steady for the first time in weeks. But what I did next changed everything. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started snapping pictures. The insurance policy first, then the boarding school applications, then the Facebook messages still open on my laptop screen. Mom's face went white, and she lunged across the table, her hand reaching for my phone, but I was already moving backward toward the hallway. My legs felt shaky, but I kept the camera steady, getting shots of Dad's folder with my name on it, the documents they'd spread out thinking I'd just sign and disappear. Mom knocked over her water glass, trying to grab me, and the liquid spread across the papers, but I had everything saved already. My heart was doing this weird fast thing where I couldn't catch my breath properly, but I kept backing up, kept taking pictures, even got one of their faces looking panicked and angry at the same time. Dad stood up so fast his chair fell over backward. He moved to block the doorway, his body filling the entire frame like he was a wall I couldn't get past. His voice dropped into that scary, calm tone he'd been using for weeks, the one that made my skin feel cold. He told me to give him the phone, that we needed to talk about this like adults, but I was done talking. I told him I wasn't going anywhere voluntarily, and he needed to move, but he just stood there while Mom scrambled around the table gathering up all the papers I'd spread out. She was crying now, these big dramatic sobs, but her hands were moving fast and organized like she'd practiced this. I tried to squeeze past Dad, but he shifted his weight and I couldn't get through. The hallway was right there, maybe 3 feet away, but he was blocking it completely. Behind me, Mom was shoving documents back into folders, and I realized if I didn't move now, I'd lose my chance. I faked left, and when Dad moved to block me, I ducked right and slipped past him into the hallway. My shoulder hit the doorframe hard enough to hurt, but I didn't stop. I ran straight to the bathroom and slammed the door, my fingers shaking so bad I almost couldn't turn the lock. It clicked, and I heard Dad's footsteps pounding down the hallway behind me. I leaned against the sink and opened my phone, pulling up the Photos app. 32 pictures. I had 32 pieces of evidence showing exactly what they'd been planning. My hands were shaking so badly the first time I tried to select them all I missed and had to start over. The upload to cloud storage seemed to take forever, that little circle spinning and spinning while I heard Mom and Dad outside the door. I typed in my school email address, attached all the photos, sent them to myself, tried to type my password for the cloud backup and got it wrong. Tried again, still wrong, took a breath and forced my fingers to slow down, and the third time it worked. The files started uploading, and I watched that progress bar like my life depended on it. They started pounding on the bathroom door, their voices switching between pleading and threatening in a way that would have worked on me a month ago. Mom was saying she was sorry, that they could work this out, that I was overreacting, and we just needed to calm down and talk. Dad's voice came through deeper, saying I was making this harder than it needed to be, that they were trying to do what was best for everyone. I ignored them and checked my email on my phone. The message was there with all the attachments. I checked my cloud storage. Everything had uploaded. I had backups of the backups now, and they couldn't take that away even if they got my phone. But I needed help from someone outside this house, someone who could see what was happening and tell me I wasn't crazy. I opened my texts and messaged my best friend, keeping it vague because I didn't know if they could somehow see my messages. Just asked if I could crash at his place tonight. Said I'd explain later. He responded almost immediately asking if I was okay, and I said I would be, but I needed to leave my house right now. He said yes, without asking more questions, and I almost cried from relief. They were still pounding on the door, their voices getting louder, and I sat on the closed toilet lid and waited. I wasn't coming out until I had a plan. I wasn't signing anything. I wasn't leaving voluntarily, so they could collect their money. An hour passed with them alternating between begging and yelling. Finally, it got quiet out there, and I cracked the door open. They were sitting on the couch in the living room, and they looked exhausted and scared instead of angry. Mom's face was all red and puffy from real crying this time, not the fake stuff. Dad was staring at the wall with his hands clasped between his knees. When I came out, Mom looked up and her voice was small. Dad asked if we could just talk like a family, if we could work this out, but I knew it was another trick. Families don't do what they'd been doing to me. Families don't try to break their kids so they'll leave for money. I went to my room and started packing a bag while they followed and stood in my doorway. They didn't try to stop me, but they kept making comments about how I was proving their point, how I was choosing to be difficult, how they'd tried to handle this maturely. I ignored every word and grabbed my laptop, my charger, the folder of documents I'd hidden under my mattress days ago when I first found everything. I packed clothes and my toothbrush and the photo of me as a baby that used to sit on the mantel before they took it down. When my friend's mom pulled up outside, I walked past them without looking back. She must have heard something wrong in my voice when I called because she didn't ask any questions on the drive to their house. She just said I could stay as long as I needed, that their guest room was mine, that I was safe now. I almost cried from the simple kindness of it, from someone just being nice without wanting something in return. That night I couldn't sleep in their guest room, not because of cameras or inspections, but because of the weight of everything I knew now. I pulled out my laptop and opened the Facebook messages between my bio mom and my parents, reading through years of rejected attempts at contact. Christina had been trying since I was 5 years old. Every birthday, she'd send a message asking how I was doing. Every Christmas, she'd ask if she could send a card. My parents never responded except to tell her to stop contacting them. But then 3 months ago, the tone changed. Christina wrote that she knew about the insurance policy, that she'd pay them double if they'd let her back into my life. She said she'd made mistakes when she was young, but she wanted to fix them. She said she thought about me every single day. The messages got more desperate after that, and I could see my parents had read every single one, but never replied. I read until my eyes burned, and the sun started coming up outside the window. The next morning, I forced myself to go to the school, because missing would just give them ammunition. In first period, I sat at my desk and stared at nothing, while my English teacher talked about symbolism in some book I hadn't read. She noticed I wasn't taking notes, wasn't even looking at her, and she asked if I was okay. I said I didn't sleep well and she let it go, but she kept glancing at me like she wanted to say more. At lunch, I walked straight past the cafeteria and headed to the counseling office. I asked the secretary if I could see Frances Black, the counselor who'd helped me last year when I was failing chemistry, and she'd worked out a study plan with me. The secretary started to say Frances was booked, but Frances must have heard my voice because she came out of her office. She took one look at my face and told the secretary to cancel her next appointment. She closed the door behind us and sat down across from me and waited for me to be ready to talk. I started talking, and once I started, I couldn't stop. The words came out in this messy rush about the locked door at 7 p.m. and how I thought it was a joke at first. I told her about the 3 a.m. inspections, how they'd burst in screaming and counting my shoes while I was half asleep. I explained the cameras they installed that beeped every 30 seconds all night long until I couldn't sleep anymore. Just waited for them to come in. Frances wrote notes on a yellow pad, but she never interrupted, never told me to slow down or questioned if I was telling the truth. I showed her the photos on my phone, swiping through images of the camera mounts still visible on my walls and screenshots of the insurance policy I'd found. I pulled up the Facebook messages between my parents and Christina, years of her begging for contact, and my parents ignoring her until 3 months ago when everything changed. Frances read through them carefully, her face getting more serious with each swipe. I told her about finding the folder with boarding school applications already filled out, about the dinner where they admitted the pregnancy and said I was worth $50,000 if I left voluntarily. My voice cracked when I described how Dad said they loved me until the pregnancy test, how I became a problem with a solution. When I finally stopped talking, Frances was quiet for a long moment. She set down her pen and looked at me directly. "Do you feel safe going home?" she asked. The question hit me harder than I expected because nobody had asked me that, not once during all of this. I shook my head and told her I was staying with a friend, that I packed a bag and left last night. Frances nodded slowly and explained that what I was describing constituted emotional abuse and financial exploitation. She said as a school counselor she was a mandatory reporter, which meant she had to contact Child Protective Services. The words, Child Protective Services, made my stomach drop. I'd heard stories about CPS, about kids getting taken away and put in foster homes with strangers. What if they didn't believe me? What if this made everything worse and my parents found some way to twist it around? Frances must have seen the panic on my face, because she leaned forward and her voice got gentler. She explained this wasn't about punishment, it was about keeping me safe and making sure I had options. She asked if she could make the call right now while I was in her office, and I nodded because I didn't trust my voice to work. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she apparently had memorized. I sat there listening to her give a detailed report to whoever answered, using words like systematic sleep deprivation and financial coercion that made what happened sound even worse somehow. She described the cameras, the inspections, the insurance policy, speaking in this calm, professional voice that made it all feel real in a way it hadn't before. The person on the other end must have asked to speak with me, because Frances held out the phone. I took it with shaking hands and said hello. The CPS worker introduced herself and asked me to tell her what happened in my own words. I repeated the whole story again, and weirdly my voice was steadier this time, like saying it out loud twice made it more solid and less like something I might have imagined. She asked specific questions about dates and times, about whether my parents had physically hurt me or just the psychological stuff. She wanted to know where I was staying now and if I felt safe there. When I said yes, she told me someone would come to interview me at the school tomorrow during my free period. She said in the meantime I should stay where I was safe, and she asked if my parents knew where I was staying. I said yes, because my friend's mom had picked me up right in front of our house. The CPS worker's voice got more serious, and she said she'd advise my friend's family to document any contact attempts from my parents, to save texts and voicemails, and not delete anything. After the call ended, Frances helped me think through practical stuff I hadn't even considered. She said I should talk to my teachers about getting extensions on assignments, since I'd missed so much sleep lately and was dealing with a crisis. She asked if I had my medications and important documents like my birth certificate and social security card. I hadn't even thought about that stuff when I was packing. She wrote down her cell number on a sticky note and told me to call any time, day or night, if I needed anything or just needed to talk. She said she'd email my teachers today to let them know I was dealing with a family emergency without giving details. I left her office feeling numb and strange, like I was watching myself walk through the hallway instead of actually doing it. The rest of the school day passed in this weird blur where I sat in classes, but couldn't tell you what any of the teachers said. That afternoon, my phone started blowing up with messages from my parents. The first few were apologetic, saying they'd overreacted and we should talk this through as a family. Then they got angry, demanding I come home immediately and stop being dramatic. Then they switched to manipulation, saying they'd drop the whole thing about me leaving, that we could work this out, that they just wanted what was best for me. I knew it was because they realized I had evidence now, that I'd documented everything, and they couldn't just gaslight me into thinking I'd imagined it all. My friend's mom knocked on the guest room door that evening and asked if she could come in. I showed her some of the messages and watched her face go hard as she read them. She told me I didn't have to respond to any of it, that I didn't owe them anything right now. She said she was going to talk to her husband about what legal options might exist, because this situation wasn't normal or okay, and they wanted to make sure I was protected. After dinner, I pulled out my laptop and started researching adoption disruption policies and insurance fraud. I found articles about cases where adoptive parents had tried to claim insurance money by forcing kids to leave, and in some of them, the parents had been charged with crimes. The more I read about how the policies were supposed to work versus how my parents tried to use ours, the angrier I got. This wasn't some desperate mistake they made in a moment of panic. They'd planned this, researched it, figured out exactly how to manipulate me into leaving voluntarily so they could collect the money. They'd installed cameras and done inspections and locked me in my room, all as part of a calculated plan to break me down. Around 8 p.m., my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer because I was so overwhelmed with everything, but something made me pick up. Christina's voice came through warm and worried, asking if I was okay because she'd gotten this weird feeling something was wrong. I guess after years of trying to reach me, she'd developed some kind of instinct about it. I started crying before I even got the first word out, just these ugly sobs that made it hard to breathe. Christina went quiet on the other end, and waited while I tried to pull myself together enough to talk. When I finally managed to speak, everything poured out in this jumbled mess about the locked door and the cameras and the insurance policy, and how my parents wanted me gone, so they could get $50,000 for their real baby. She listened to every word without interrupting, and I could hear her crying too by the time I got to the part about finding the messages she'd sent over the years. She told me she'd been trying to reach me since I turned 13, that she never wanted money from my parents, she just needed to know I was safe and happy. Her voice cracked when she said she'd spent 4 years sending messages and getting either silence or threats of legal action in response. I asked why she gave me up in the first place if she cared so much, and she didn't dodge the question or make excuses. She explained that she got pregnant at 19 with a guy who disappeared the second he found out, and she was working at a gas station trying to finish community college with no family support. She said the adoption agency made it sound like I'd have this perfect life with parents who desperately wanted a baby, and she thought she was doing the right thing, even though it killed her to sign the papers. Now she's 23 years older, married to a man named Wallace who she met 5 years ago, and she works as a dental assistant making decent money. She said she's been saving money in a separate account since I turned 16, hoping that maybe someday I'd want to meet her or go to college, or just have something from her that wasn't wrapped up in guilt and regret. We talked for almost 2 hours about everything. She told me stories about the first 6 weeks of my life before the adoption was finalized, how I had this tiny birthmark on my left shoulder blade, and how I used to fall asleep only if someone was humming. She explained how she found my parents through the adoption agency's contact system and started trying to send letters and photos when I was little, but my parents blocked everything and eventually threatened to get a restraining order if she didn't stop. She found them on social media a few years ago, and that's when she started sending the messages I'd seen on Mom's laptop, begging for just one update or photo to know I was okay. When she saw their post about the pregnancy 4 months ago, something clicked for her about why they might suddenly be treating me differently, and that's when she sent the message about the insurance that I'd found. She was honest about her mistakes, and didn't try to paint herself as some hero who'd been waiting to rescue me. She admitted she'd made terrible choices as a teenager, and that giving me up was both the hardest and most selfish thing she'd ever done. That honesty made me trust her more than if she'd tried to promise me everything would be perfect now. By the time we hung up, my throat hurt from talking and crying, but I felt less alone than I had in months. The next day, I dragged myself to the school running on maybe 3 hours of sleep. During my free period right before lunch, the front office called me down, and I found a woman waiting in the conference room next to the counselor's office. She introduced herself as Sushma Tran from Child Protective Services and shook my hand with this firm, no-nonsense grip that somehow made me feel like she actually gave a damn. She had a folder with notes from Francis and the phone call from yesterday, and she explained that she needed to interview me to understand what was happening and figure out next steps. I pulled out my phone and showed her everything I'd uploaded to the cloud, the photos of the insurance documents and boarding school applications, and the folder with my name on it. She looked through each image carefully, zooming in on the policy details and taking notes on her tablet. Then I showed her the screenshots of messages between my parents and Christina, and the timestamps on the photos I'd taken of the cameras in my room before I left. Sushma asked me to walk her through the timeline starting from when my parents first locked my door, and I told her about the inspections at 3 in the morning and the constant beeping from the cameras and how they'd gone from relaxed parents to psychological terrorists in the span of 2 weeks. She asked specific questions about the sleep thing, like how many hours I was getting per night and whether I'd seen a doctor about the exhaustion. I admitted I'd been too scared to tell anyone because I thought maybe I was being dramatic, like Mom kept saying. Sushma wrote something down and told me that sleep deprivation is a recognized form of abuse, especially when it's deliberate and used to break someone down mentally. She asked me to repeat exactly what my parents said at dinner about the insurance money and their real baby, and I went through the whole conversation word for word because it was burned into my memory. When I got to the part where Mom pushed the paper across the table and told me to sign saying I wanted to live with Grandma, Sushma's jaw got tight and she made another note. She explained that what they were trying to do was technically insurance fraud, using psychological abuse to force a voluntary departure so they could collect money meant for actual adoption disruptions caused by the child's behavior or needs. The way she said it, clinical and matter-of-fact, made me realize how messed up the whole thing really was. Sushma told me that CPS would do a home visit within the next few days to talk to my parents and assess the situation, but given my age and the evidence I'd collected, she'd be recommending I stay in alternative placement rather than returning home. She asked if I had any family I could stay with besides my friend's parents, and I hesitated before mentioning Christina. I wasn't sure if bio parents counted as real family in the eyes of CPS, or if bringing her up would make things more complicated. Sushma's whole face changed when I said I'd been in contact with my biological mother, and she asked how long we'd been talking, and whether Christina knew about the current situation. I explained about the phone call last night, and how Christina had been trying to reach me for years, but my parents blocked her. Sushma asked if Christina had expressed interest in having me live with her, and I said we hadn't really discussed it, but she seemed like she wanted to be part of my life, in whatever way was possible. That's when Sushma said something that made my chest feel tight in a way that might have been hope. She explained that kinship placement with biological family is actually ideal in situations like mine, as long as the bio parent is willing and can pass a background check and home study. She asked for Christina's contact information and said she'd reach out within the next day or two to discuss the possibility and start the evaluation process. I gave her Christina's number and address, my hands shaking a little because suddenly this felt real in a way it hadn't before. Sushma packed up her tablet and folder and told me she'd be in touch soon with updates and that I should keep staying where I was safe and document any attempts my parents made to contact me. She gave me her direct number and said to call immediately if anything happened that made me feel unsafe or pressured. That afternoon, I was sitting in Francis's office during last period when the front office secretary's voice came over the intercom, asking for security to come to the main entrance. Francis and I looked at each other, and she got up to check what was happening, telling me to stay in her office. I moved to the window that looked out over the front parking lot and saw my parents' car pulled up to the curb with both of them standing at the entrance doors. Mom was gesturing wildly, and Dad had his hand on her arm like he was trying to calm her down, but his face looked angry too. The security guard, who usually just checks IDs and breaks up fights, was standing between them and the door, and I watched the principal come out to talk to them. Even from the second floor I could see Mom's mouth moving fast, her voice probably getting that shrill edge it got when she wasn't getting her way. The principal crossed his arms and shook his head, pointing back toward their car. Dad stepped forward and said something that made the principal pull out his phone, and that's when my parents finally seemed to realize they weren't going to win this. They turned to leave, but Dad stopped and turned back, his voice carrying across the parking lot loud enough that I could hear him through the closed window. He shouted something about me destroying the family, about how I was manipulated by people who didn't understand the whole situation. Mom grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the car, while the principal stood there with his phone still in his hand, probably ready to call the police if they didn't leave. I watched them drive away, Mom's face visible through the passenger window looking red and angry. Francis came back a few minutes later and closed the blinds, sitting down across from me with this tired expression. She reminded me that their choices destroyed the family, not my decision to protect myself and tell the truth about what they'd been doing. She said parents who truly love their kids don't torture them psychologically for insurance money, and that I needed to remember that every time I started feeling guilty. I nodded, but didn't trust myself to speak, because part of me still wanted to believe they'd loved me once, before the pregnancy test changed everything. Over the next few days, I fell into this weird routine at my friend's house. I'd wake up in the guest room without cameras watching me, or the fear of a 3 a.m. inspection, eat breakfast with his family, and go to the school where I'd try to focus on assignments and pretend everything was normal. Sushma called every other day with updates about the investigation and the home visit and Christina's background check. Christina started texting me every morning with simple messages, just checking in to see how I was doing without being pushy or demanding responses. Sometimes I'd text back right away, and sometimes I'd wait until lunch, but she never complained about the delayed responses or asked for more than I could give. My parents kept trying to call and text, but I'd blocked their numbers on Sushma's advice, so they started emailing instead. The messages swung between apologetic and threatening, sometimes within the same paragraph, and my friend's mom printed them all out as documentation like Sushma had suggested. The home visit happened 3 days later while I was at the school. Sushma called me that afternoon to tell me how it went, and I could hear something in her voice that made my chest feel less tight. She said my parents had been prepared, the house spotless and organized, both of them dressed nice and speaking calmly about how worried they were about me. Mom apparently cried while explaining how the pregnancy had been stressful, and maybe they'd been too strict, but they just wanted what was best for their son. Dad showed Sushma my report cards and talked about college plans, painting this picture of concerned parents dealing with a rebellious teenager. But then Sushma went to my room, and she saw the holes in the walls where the camera mounts had been. 4 perfect circles of unpainted drywall that my parents hadn't thought to patch. She asked about them, and Mom stammered something about old shelving, but the mounts were clearly visible in the photos I'd taken. Sushma told me she didn't buy any of it, especially after seeing the documentation I'd provided and hearing the calculation in how they presented everything. 2 days after that, a thick envelope arrived at my friend's house addressed to Child Protective Services, with a copy sent to me. The lawyer's letter was 8 pages long, printed on fancy letterhead, full of words like misinterpretation and appropriate parental authority and adolescent behavioral challenges. I sat on the guest bed reading it, my hands shaking, as they reframed every single thing they'd done to me. The locked door became establishing boundaries for a teenager who'd demonstrated poor judgment. The 3 a.m. inspections were necessary supervision due to concerning behavioral changes. The cameras were safety measures recommended by a family counselor, even though we'd never seen a counselor. They claimed the insurance policy was a standard adoption protection plan, and I'd taken it out of context because I was angry about normal parenting decisions. The letter made me sound unstable, and them sound reasonable, and I felt sick reading it because I could see how someone who didn't know the full story might actually believe them. My friend's mom found me crying in the bathroom an hour later. The letter crumpled on the floor, and she smoothed it out carefully to add to the documentation file. Sushma called the next morning to tell me her supervisor was now involved because of the insurance fraud angle. She explained that cases involving financial exploitation got escalated automatically, and suddenly there were more people asking questions about the policy and its terms. That afternoon, a detective from the Financial Crimes Unit called my cell phone, his voice professional but kind, asking if I could walk him through exactly what my parents had said at dinner. I sat in my friend's backyard with a notebook, going through the conversation word by word, remembering how Dad had set down his water glass and how Mom's hand had moved to her stomach. The detective asked specific questions about whether they'd used the phrase, "only if you leave on your own," and whether they'd shown me the policy documents before or after the dinner confrontation. I answered everything as precisely as I could, my voice steady even though my hands were shaking, because I knew this mattered. He told me the insurance company was conducting their own investigation and thanked me for being so detailed and organized with my evidence. 4 days later, Sushma called with news that made my whole body go numb. Christina had passed her background check and home study, and CPS was approving her for kinship placement. Sushma explained this was temporary while the investigation continued, but it meant I could move in with Christina instead of staying with my friend's family or going into foster care. She said kinship placement was always the preferred option when biofamily was available and appropriate, and everything about Christina's situation checked out. I thanked her and hung up, then just sat there staring at my phone, feeling terrified and excited at the same time. Christina and I had been talking on the phone almost every day, and we'd done video chats where I could see her apartment and meet Wallace, but we'd never actually been in the same room together. Now I was supposed to move into her home, and figure out if we could actually be family, if this woman who gave birth to me could become someone I trusted after everything that had happened. The transition happened on a Saturday morning with Sushma supervising the whole thing. Christina's apartment was in a complex about 20 minutes from my school, small but clean with actual sunlight coming through the windows. She'd set up the second bedroom for me with basics, a bed with a blue comforter, a desk with a new lamp, empty shelves along one wall waiting for my stuff. The walls were painted light gray, and there was a poster of the solar system still in its wrapper on the desk, like she'd bought it, but wasn't sure if I'd want it. Wallace stayed mostly in the kitchen while Christina showed me around, giving me space but making it clear I was welcome. He was tall and quiet, maybe 40, with kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. Christina kept asking if everything was okay, if I needed anything, her hands fidgeting with her shirt hem, like she was as nervous as I was. I put my bags down in the room that was apparently mine now, and told her it was perfect, even though perfect felt like a weird word for any of this. My parents tried to block the placement 2 days later with an emergency court filing. Sushma called to tell me about it, her voice tight with anger, explaining that their lawyer was claiming Christina was unstable, and I was manipulated by CPS. The filing said I needed to be returned home immediately for my own safety, that the state was overreaching based on a misunderstanding between parents and their teenage son. The judge reviewed all the evidence that same afternoon, including the photos of the camera mounts, the insurance policy documents, the timeline of abuse, and my detailed statement. He denied their motion completely and issued an order that they had to stay away from me, except for supervised visits that they could only request through Sushma. The judge apparently used the phrase, concerning pattern of psychological abuse, in his ruling, which Sushma said was significant because it meant he saw through their lawyer's reframing attempts. The first week at Christina's was awkward, as we figured out how to exist in the same space. She worked during the day at a dental office, leaving around 7:30 and getting home around 5, which meant I had the apartment to myself after school. I'd do homework at the desk in my room, or watch TV in the living room, feeling weird about touching anything, even though she'd told me to make myself at home. We ate dinner together every night, sitting at her small kitchen table, making conversation that sometimes flowed and sometimes didn't. She asked about school and my classes, I asked about her job and her patients, and we both avoided talking about my parents or the investigation or anything too heavy. Wallace joined us most nights, adding his own stories about his work in IT support, and slowly the silences became less uncomfortable. Christina never pushed me to call her mom, or to share more than I was ready to, and I appreciated that more than I could explain. Frances checked in regularly, calling every few days and scheduling counseling sessions twice a week at the school. We'd sit in her office and she'd help me process everything, the move and the court filing and the weird feeling of living with someone who was technically my mother, but felt like a stranger. She reminded me that building a relationship with Christina would take time, maybe months or years, and it was okay to have complicated feelings about all of it. The adoption, the abuse, the sudden change, none of it was simple or easy. She said I didn't have to choose between being angry at my adoptive parents and being open to Christina, that I could hold both feelings at the same time. Some sessions I cried, some sessions I just sat there numb, and Frances never made me feel like I was doing any of it wrong. I started sleeping better without the cameras and the 3 a.m. inspections, my body finally relaxing enough to get through whole nights. But the nightmares came anyway, dreams where I was locked in my room and couldn't get out, or where my parents showed up at Christina's apartment to drag me back home. I'd wake up gasping, my heart pounding, taking a few seconds to remember where I actually was. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m. from a particularly bad one, and I must have made noise because Christina knocked softly on my door a few minutes later. She asked through the door if I was okay, if I wanted tea, her voice gentle and not pushy. I opened the door and nodded, and we ended up sitting at the kitchen table until almost 5 in the morning, drinking chamomile tea and talking about fear and safety and what home was supposed to feel like. She told me about her own nightmares after she placed me for adoption, how she'd wake up wondering if I was okay, if I was happy, if I'd ever forgive her. I told her about the cameras and the inspections and the feeling of being watched constantly, and she listened without trying to fix it, just being there while I finally said it all out loud. School became the one place where things made sense again. My teachers didn't ask questions when I turned in assignments a day late or zoned out during lectures. They just gave me understanding looks and told me to take my time. My friends noticed something was different, but they didn't push. They'd just include me in lunch conversations about normal stuff like video games and upcoming tests, giving me space to be a regular student instead of the kid with the messed up family situation. I threw myself into homework and class schedules because having a routine felt safe when everything else in my life had turned upside down. Chemistry homework was just chemistry homework, not some test my parents designed to break me, and that simple fact made me want to cry sometimes. Frances checked in with me between classes, just quick conversations in the hallway where she'd ask how I was sleeping and if I needed anything, and knowing she was there made the whole building feel more solid. 2 weeks into living with Christina, Sushma called to tell me my parents had requested a supervised visit through CPS. My stomach dropped, and I wanted to say no immediately, but Sushma explained it was part of the legal process, and the court would look at my willingness to engage. I agreed only if the visit happened at the CPS office with Sushma physically in the room the entire time, no exceptions. She said that was completely reasonable, and scheduled it for the following Tuesday after school. The days leading up to it felt heavy, like I was walking around with weights attached to my chest, and Christina noticed but didn't make me talk about it if I didn't want to. The CPS office was in a bland government building with fluorescent lights and beige walls that made everything feel cold and official. Sushma met me in the lobby and walked me to a small conference room where my parents were already sitting on one side of a table. Mom's eyes were red and puffy before we even started, and Dad sat rigid in his chair with his arms crossed, staring at the wall behind my head. I took the seat across from them with Sushma beside me, and the silence stretched out uncomfortable and thick until Mom finally spoke. She said they were desperate and made terrible choices, that the financial pressure made them crazy, and she was so sorry for everything they put me through. Her voice cracked and tears ran down her face, but I just sat there feeling numb and angry at the same time. Dad stayed silent, his jaw clenched tight, and I could see he was furious, but trying to hold it in for Sushma's benefit. I told them I needed time and space, that they couldn't just erase months of psychological torture with one conversation and some tears. Mom reached across the table like she wanted to touch my hand, but I pulled back, and Sushma made a note on her clipboard. The room felt too small and too big at the same time, like we were strangers forced to sit together and pretend we were family. Dad finally spoke, his voice flat and controlled, saying they never meant to hurt me, and they thought they were doing what was necessary. I almost laughed because necessary meant breaking your kid down piece by piece until they ran away, but I kept my mouth shut because getting angry wouldn't help anything. Then Mom brought up the pregnancy, saying she was 6 months along now, and they wanted me to be part of the baby's life, to be a big brother and help raise my sibling. Something snapped inside me and I lost it, my voice getting loud as I told her she couldn't use an unborn baby to manipulate me after spending months treating me like a financial transaction. I said she didn't get to play happy family now when she'd literally tried to drive me out of the only home I'd ever known for insurance money. Sushma put her hand on my arm and said my name quietly, reminding me to take a breath, but I was shaking with rage and couldn't stop. Mom started crying harder, saying I was being cruel and unfair, and Dad's face went dark as he told me to watch my tone. Sushma cut in firmly, saying the visit was over, and we all needed to cool down before anyone said something they'd regret more. I left the room without looking back, and Christina was waiting in the lobby, having come early to pick me up. She took one look at my face and didn't ask questions, just guided me out to her car with her hand on my shoulder. We drove to an ice cream place near her apartment, and she bought us both sundaes, sitting across from me in a sticky booth. While I ranted about how unfair it was that my parents got to play victims now when they were the ones who orchestrated everything, she just listened and ate her ice cream, nodding at the right moments, but not trying to fix anything or offer some wise parenting advice. When I finally ran out of words, she said sometimes people don't deserve forgiveness right away, and it was okay to be angry, as long as I didn't let it eat me alive. The next week, Sushma called with an update about the insurance company. The detective had contacted them about the policy, and they'd launched their own investigation into the sketchy clauses my parents had included. Apparently, the whole voluntary departure thing, plus the timing with the pregnancy, made the company suspicious about fraud, and they'd suspended the policy pending their review. My parents' lawyer tried to argue it was legitimate financial planning for potential disruption, but the insurance company wasn't buying it. Sushma said this was actually good for my case because it showed a pattern of calculated behavior, not just desperate parents making one bad choice. Frances told me during our next counseling session that my parents' financial situation was getting worse. They couldn't collect the insurance money, they were paying for lawyers to fight both CPS and the insurance investigation, and they were facing potential criminal charges for child abuse and fraud. Part of me felt guilty hearing that, like maybe I'd destroyed their lives by reporting everything, but Frances shut that down immediately. She reminded me that consequences exist for a reason, and my parents made active choices to abuse and manipulate me for money. Their financial problems were the result of their own actions, not mine, and I needed to stop taking responsibility for their mistakes. Living with Christina started to feel less weird as we built small traditions together. Friday nights became movie nights where we'd order pizza and watch whatever was streaming, and Sunday mornings she made pancakes while Wallace read the news on his tablet. We'd take evening walks around the neighborhood after dinner, not talking about anything heavy, just pointing out houses we liked or complaining about the weather. Christina told me stories about my early childhood that my adoptive parents never shared, like how I used to laugh at everything as a baby, and how she'd sing to me even though she couldn't carry a tune. These little glimpses of who I might have been if I'd grown up with her made me sad and curious at the same time, wondering about the alternate version of my life that never happened. Wallace opened up more as the weeks passed, sharing his own story about growing up in foster care and bouncing between homes until he aged out at 18. He talked about how family isn't just biology, it's about choice and commitment and showing up even when things get hard. He treated me like a person with my own thoughts and opinions, not a project to fix or a problem to solve, and that made the apartment feel more like home than my old house ever had. We'd play video games together sometimes, or he'd help me with math homework, just normal stuff that made me feel like maybe I could be part of a real family again. 3 months into the placement, Sushma scheduled a meeting to discuss permanency planning. She explained that CPS was recommending the kinship arrangement with Christina become permanent, with her as my legal guardian until I turned 18. My parents were fighting it through their lawyer, but even he admitted they were unlikely to win, given the documented abuse and the ongoing criminal investigation. Sushma said the court would make the final decision, but she was confident about the outcome, and she wanted to prepare me for what the hearing would involve. Christina sat next to me during the meeting, her hand resting on the table near mine, and I realized I wanted this to be permanent too, wanted to stop waiting for everything to fall apart again. The court hearing happened 3 weeks later on a Wednesday morning. Sushma drove me to the courthouse, and we sat on hard wooden benches outside the courtroom waiting for our turn. The hallway smelled like floor cleaner and old coffee, and lawyers in suits walked past us carrying folders and talking on their phones. When they called my case number, we walked into a small courtroom that looked nothing like the ones on TV, just a judge's desk and a few chairs and fluorescent lights that buzzed. The judge was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She looked through the case file for what felt like forever, while Sushma and I sat there not talking. Finally, she asked me directly if I felt safe living with Christina, and I said yes, without having to think about it. She asked if I wanted to continue the placement, and I said yes again. She asked if anyone had pressured me to say that, and I told her no, that Christina had actually told me I could change my mind any time if I wanted. The judge nodded and made some notes. Then she looked at the empty chairs where my parents should have been sitting. She said she was granting the guardianship order effective immediately, making Christina my legal guardian until I turned 18. The whole thing took maybe 15 minutes. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt weird, like something huge had just happened, but it was so quick and boring that it didn't feel real. Sushma hugged me in the parking lot and said she was proud of how I handled everything. That night, Christina made spaghetti and meatballs, which she remembered was my favorite from when I was little. We ate at the kitchen table with Wallace, and nobody made a big dramatic speech about the guardianship. Christina just got up after dinner and came back with a key on a plain keychain. She put it in my hand and said, "This was my home for as long as I wanted it. No conditions or clauses attached." I held the key and felt the weight of it. This small metal thing that meant I had a place I could actually stay. Wallace raised his water glass and said we should toast to new beginnings, and we clinked our glasses together like a normal family. I believed Christina because she had proven everything through her actions, not just words. She had opened her home, passed the background checks, showed up to every meeting, and never once tried to force me into calling her mom or pretending the past didn't happen. 2 weeks later, I started seeing a therapist who worked specifically with kids dealing with adoption trauma and family abuse. Her office was in a building near the community college, with comfortable chairs and tissues on every table. The first session was awkward, because I didn't know what to say, but she made it easier by asking specific questions about the timeline and what happened. I told her about the locked door and the cameras and the insurance policy, and she listened without looking shocked or judgmental. She said we would work on unpacking everything at my own pace. The sessions were hard in ways I didn't expect, not because she pushed me, but because talking about it made it real in a different way. I had to face the abandonment I felt when Christina gave me up, even though I understood why she did it. I had to process the manipulation from my adoptive parents and the grief for the parents I thought I had, the ones who tucked me in and called me their miracle before everything changed. Some days I left therapy feeling worse than when I went in, but my therapist said that was normal, that healing meant going through the pain instead of around it. After a few months, she helped me understand something important about my adoptive parents. She said I could be angry at them for what they did, and still see them as human beings who made terrible choices when they were desperate and scared. It didn't excuse the abuse or make it okay, but it helped me stop taking it so personally. She explained that I wasn't unlovable or defective. They were just broken in ways I couldn't fix, and their actions said more about them than about me. That shift in thinking made the weight feel lighter somehow, like I could be mad without it eating me alive. School got easier as my living situation stopped being chaos. My grades climbed back up, because I could actually sleep at night and focus during class. I joined the robotics club because I needed something normal and hands-on, and it turned out I was pretty good at the programming part. By spring, I was thinking about college applications, which felt impossible a year ago when I couldn't see past the next room inspection. Frances helped me figure out the application process and which schools had good engineering programs. She wrote me a recommendation letter that made me cry when she showed me a copy, because she actually saw who I was beyond the kid with the messed-up family situation. She wrote about my resilience and problem-solving skills and how I advocated for myself when it mattered most. One Saturday afternoon, Christina and I were folding laundry together when she brought up the topic of contact with my adoptive parents. She said we should talk about what I wanted, if anything, and reminded me that it was completely my choice. I told her I wasn't ready to see them or talk to them, maybe not for a long time, but I didn't know if that would change. She nodded and said, healing wasn't a straight line, that I might feel different in 6 months or a year or 5 years, and whatever I decided was okay. She said she would support me either way and wouldn't be hurt if I eventually wanted some kind of relationship with them. That conversation mattered because she was giving me permission to have complicated feelings without making it about her. My parents' legal troubles dragged on for months, but finally got resolved through a plea deal. Their lawyer convinced the prosecutor to accept probation instead of jail time, plus fines and mandatory counseling sessions. They also had to pay restitution to cover my therapy costs, which felt like justice in a small way. The insurance company finished their investigation and denied the claim entirely based on evidence of fraud. Sushma told me they lost all credibility with CPS and would have a hard time adopting again if they tried. I didn't feel happy about it exactly, more like the universe had balanced something that was out of whack. In early spring, my adoptive mom had the baby, and she sent a photo through Sushma because we still weren't in direct contact. I looked at that picture for a long time, this tiny person with a scrunched-up face and a blue hat. The baby was technically my sibling, shared the same parents who raised me for 15 years. I felt sad looking at that photo, not jealous, but sad for what could have been if they had made different choices. I wondered if they would love this baby the way they used to love me, before the pregnancy test changed everything. I hoped they would do better this time. I started writing my parents a letter one night when I couldn't sleep. I told them I wasn't ready for contact, but I hoped they would be better parents to my sibling than they were to me in the end. I said I understood they were desperate and scared, but that didn't make what they did okay. I wrote that I was doing fine with Christina, and they didn't need to worry about me anymore. The letter sat in my desk drawer for 3 weeks, because I kept changing my mind about sending it. Finally, I put it in an envelope and mailed it before I could overthink it again. It felt like closing a door that needed to be closed, not locking it forever, but shutting it for now. Something shifted with Christina around that time. Subtle, but important. I stopped thinking before I called her by her first name and started just saying Mom naturally, the way it slipped out when I wasn't paying attention. The first time it happened, we were making breakfast, and I asked if Mom wanted coffee. She stopped stirring the pancake batter and got tears in her eyes. She said she never expected that gift, and didn't take it for granted, that I could call her whatever felt right. Wallace heard us from the living room and came in grinning. He said now I was stuck with both of them, which made us all laugh and broke the tension. It felt right calling her Mom because she had earned it through showing up every single day, not because biology said she should be called that. A few weeks later, Christina set up her laptop on the kitchen table and told me Jasper wanted to video chat if I felt ready. My stomach did this weird flip thing, but I sat down anyway and clicked the call button. The screen loaded and there he was. A guy with dark hair going gray at the sides and the same nose I saw in the mirror every morning. He smiled and waved, looking nervous, and I realized he was probably as scared as I was about this whole thing. We talked for almost 2 hours about nothing important at first, just surface stuff like what I was studying in the school and what he did for work as an electrician. He showed me photos of his wife and 2 kids, my half-siblings, I guess, and explained he lived in Oregon, which felt impossibly far away. He never made promises about being a dad or tried to replace anyone, just said he wanted to know me if I wanted that too. Before we hung up, we talked about maybe visiting during summer break, keeping it casual and not building it up into some huge reunion that would disappoint everyone. Christina squeezed my shoulder after the call ended and asked how I felt, and I said weird, but good, which was the most honest answer I had. The next week, Frances called me into her office during lunch and spread out a bunch of scholarship applications across her desk. She explained there were specific programs for students who had been in foster care or kinship placement, and I qualified for all of them based on my living situation with Christina. We spent 3 lunch periods filling out forms and writing essays about my experiences, which felt strange putting that nightmare into words for strangers to judge. Frances helped me frame everything without making it sound like I was asking for pity, just stating facts about obstacles I had faced and overcome. By the time we finished, I had applied to 7 different scholarships, with amounts ranging from $500 to $5,000. A month later, I found out I got 4 of them, totaling almost $8,000, and suddenly college felt like something that could actually happen, instead of just a dream. Frances printed out all the award letters and put them in a folder for me, grinning like she had won the money herself. My birthday came in October, and a card showed up in the mail with my adoptive parents' return address. I stared at it for a long time before opening it, my hands shaking a little because I didn't know what to expect. Inside was a generic card with a sunset photo and printed words about wishing me happiness, plus a check for $50 that had both their signatures. There was no personal message, no acknowledgement of everything that had happened, just the pre-printed greeting and money. I walked to the bank that afternoon and cashed the check because I needed new shoes and wasn't too proud to take their money. The card went straight into the kitchen trash because I wasn't ready for empty gestures that pretended we were a normal family sending birthday wishes. Christina saw me throw it away but didn't comment, just squeezed my hand and told me we were making my favorite dinner. Senior year started in September, and I couldn't believe how different everything felt compared to a year ago. I had my own room in a place where nobody locked me in or burst through the door at 3 a.m. I had Christina and Wallace who asked about my day and actually listened to the answers. I had Frances checking in weekly and Sushma calling monthly to make sure the placement was working. I had therapy appointments where I was slowly working through the trauma instead of living inside it every single day. My grades were good again. I had joined robotics club, and I was making actual plans for college instead of just surviving until tomorrow. The nightmares still came sometimes, and I still flinched when I heard loud voices, but I was healing instead of breaking, and that made all the difference. One Saturday morning, Christina asked if I wanted to help repaint my room, since the current beige color was pretty boring. Wallace drove us to the hardware store and they let me pick out whatever colors I wanted, no questions or judgments about my choices. I chose a deep blue for 3 walls and gray for the accent wall, colors that felt calm and mine in a way the beige never had. We spent the whole weekend painting together, Wallace teaching me how to cut in along the edges, and Christina playing music from her phone while we worked. They asked my opinion about other apartment upgrades too, like whether we should get new living room curtains or if the kitchen needed better lighting. It felt strange being included in household decisions like my vote actually mattered, like I was a real part of this family, instead of a temporary guest they were stuck with. In health class, we started a unit on family dynamics and recognizing unhealthy relationships. My teacher asked if anyone wanted to do a presentation on a related topic, and before I could overthink it, I volunteered to talk about emotional abuse in families. I spent 2 weeks preparing, using my own experiences without making it obvious I was talking about myself. The presentation covered things like gaslighting, isolation tactics, sleep deprivation as punishment, and financial exploitation of children. My classmates were quiet the whole time, and afterward, 3 different people came up to say they recognized some of those patterns in their own families. My teacher pulled me aside and asked if I would be willing to share the presentation with the counseling department as a training tool. I said yes, because if my nightmare could help other students recognize abuse earlier, then maybe all that pain served some kind of purpose. Spring arrived and college acceptance letters started showing up in the mail. I got into 3 schools with decent financial aid packages that covered most of tuition when combined with my scholarships. The first acceptance letter came from a state school 2 hours away, and I ran into the kitchen yelling to show Christina. She read it 3 times, and then started crying these happy tears that made me tear up too. Wallace came home from work and gave me this awkward side hug that turned into a real hug, telling me he was proud of me. We called Frances, and she screamed so loud, I had to hold the phone away from my ear. She asked me to bring the letter to the school so she could make a copy for her office, and the next week, I saw it framed on her wall next to photos of other students she had helped over the years. My 18th birthday fell on a Tuesday in March, and I went to the courthouse during lunch to legally change my last name to Reyes. The process was simple, just forms and a small fee and a judge's signature, but it felt huge standing there with my new identification. I wasn't erasing my past or pretending the Evans family never existed. I was just choosing my future and the family that had actually shown up for me. That evening, Christina made my favorite chocolate cake from scratch, and we invited Frances and Sushma over to celebrate. The apartment was crowded with all of us squeezed around the small table, but it felt right having the people who had fought for me all in one room. Christina put 18 candles on the cake, and they sang happy birthday, while I tried not to cry. When I blew out the candles, I didn't make a wish, because for the first time in years, I didn't need to wish for things to get better. They already were. Great. Another feel-good tale that shaved 5 years off my lifespan. If you enjoy emotional cardio, subscribe and keep torturing your playlist.